Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Well, I just couldn't help myself. After the response to yesterday's video on Question Time's video about something bad about every president and just how much I disagreed with a lot of his takes, I really just had to come back to his video, Something Great About Every U.S. President in History. I've put a link in the description below. There's a lot of the video I'm not going to watch. You can see I'm starting it at 2:18. Because a lot of the beginning, and I'm sure a lot of the end, have to do with modern stuff that I avoid on this channel. And just a heads up, too, if you go posting stuff about modern politics, I will probably delete it. I've deleted some really long posts in the last couple of days. I'm trying to save you the time and energy of going on your rant about Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama or Joe Biden, because I'm just going to remove it. I don't really want that kind of stuff on the channel, so... my channel, do what I want. Sorry, I mean, that's kind of the way it is. But trying to keep this this community civil, trying to keep it about history. Don't want to get into that stuff. So I'm not saying there isn't a place for it. I'm not saying it's not important. It's just not for here. Okay, with that said, I will put the link in the description if you want to see the video in its entirety from Question Time. And I'll also put a link in the description to my video from yesterday if you didn't see that one. Let's go ahead and dive in.
George Washington defined what it means to be the President of the United States. He successfully led the American Revolution to victory as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army.
I just gotta stop for a second because in light of what he said yesterday about George Washington being like not really a person with any kind of experience and like it sounds to me like he's kind of going against what he said yesterday. He kind of made Washington sound like a guy who had no business being president. Now he's like, he defined the presidency. Oh boy, I agree, but it's just weird.
And was dedicated to Enlightenment principles of reason and rationality. He was a champion of Republican values, and despite owning slaves during his lifetime, he was the only prominent founding father to free all of them upon his death.
The only prominent founding father to free all of them on his death, but also many of the founding fathers didn't own slaves. And it's interesting to say this because I know a lot of people very often comment to me that Thomas Jefferson opposed slavery, but Virginia law prevented him from freeing his slaves upon his death. George Washington was also a Virginian, so I don't know.
John Adams never owned slaves and considered the practice abhorrent. Historians have noted him as a clear free thinker, often disagreeing with his own political party.
So, John Adams was from Massachusetts. Of course he didn't own slaves. I mean, technically you could have, but I said this yesterday. We get it. I'm not downplaying the fact that slavery was evil and should not have existed and should be loudly condemned. But if that's going to be our default for all of the pre-Civil War presidents is good person if he didn't own slaves, bad person if he did, and we can't go any deeper than that, I feel like we're missing an opportunity. We get that slavery existed and that a lot of people owned them and it was bad. But let's talk about more than just that.
And he certainly was a fine father, as his son John Quincy grew up to be one of the best presidents of all time.
All right, I'm pausing a lot here, but I got to break all this down. Okay. Yes, he was definitely a free thinker and did often oppose his own party, and I give him credit for that. But also, sometimes he did things like what we said yesterday with the Alien and Sedition Acts, where he opposed other people being free thinkers, or at least free expressors of their thoughts. Would have people jailed for disagreeing with him, and could have been very much viewed as a dictator because of that. As far as fathers go, yeah, John Quincy turned out pretty good. Probably one of our most qualified presidents ever. John Quincy held pretty much every office you can imagine. His whole life, like his father's, was dedicated to the country. Was he one of our greatest presidents of all time? I don't know. He got defeated for re-election. He only served one term, so America obviously didn't think so at the time. And also, if you look at his other son, Charles, not so great. I mean, if we're going to judge someone as a parent solely based on how their kids turn out, Charles basically drank himself to death. and was disowned by his father. So it goes both ways.
With the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson doubled the territory of his country overnight. He drafted the Declaration of Independence and was a leading proponent of one of America's most important values, secularism.
So, obviously I'm a Christian, so I'm speaking from a particular bias on this topic. I don't know if, number one, America has as it's one of its most important values secularism. And he says his wall is better than Trump. He's talking about Jefferson is the one who coined, or at least popularized, the term separation of church and state. He wrote about a wall of separation between church and state. Doesn't mean what most people think it means, but I'm not going to get into religious debate with that. But interesting that Thomas Jefferson, a champion of small central government, uses the power of the federal government to double the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson, who opposed the idea of a standing army, is the one responsible for the founding of West Point, where we trained officers for our standing army. So he was kind of a contradiction in that way. And that's not a unique criticism of Thomas Jefferson. A lot of people, when they become president, some things that they were very strongly opposed to, their opinion and their views on those things change once they sit in that chair, once they're in the White House, once they face what they face. A lot of times that changes. So that's why I always get really uncomfortable when people run for political office and make certain promises. I'm like, you really don't know until you get in there what you're going to do. So that's why so often people promise one thing and then they get in there and do the opposite.
His wall of separation between church and state protects religious minorities from discrimination, government from being corrupted by dogmatic values, and religion from being corrupted by politics. James Madison drafted the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights. Enough said.
And here's the thing I'll say about what he said about Jefferson with the Declaration of Independence and then Madison with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. What does that have to do with them as president? Yeah, it says a lot about them as people. And I guess, if you're just saying something great about every president, it doesn't necessarily have to be something great about their presidency. Because these are things that have nothing to do with their time in office. So, I'll give him a pass on that, I guess. Entrenched your right to think he's awesome. Okay.
Unlike many founding fathers, James Monroe was a strong supporter of the French Revolution and thus the spread of Republican values. As ambassador to France, he secured the release of Thomas Paine, another international friend of liberty, who had been arrested for his opposition to the brutal execution of the deposed King of France. John Quincy Adams negotiated the end of the Foolish War of 1812, paid off much of the national debt, and promoted economic modernization and education.
I'll say this, and I get that this is a channel that isn't really necessarily claiming to be a channel about history, but man, this guy's just throwing his bias all over this stuff. Calling things like the War of 1812 foolish. Okay, well, you think it was foolish. Maybe somebody else doesn't. I would prefer not to throw those kinds of words into a description about something historical, but I understand that that's not what this channel is about.
He was a leading opponent of slavery and suggested that if a civil war were to break out, the president could end slavery by decree by using his war powers.
Kind of what Lincoln did, but it would have been overturned after the war was over, which Lincoln understood, and that's why Lincoln pushed for the 13th Amendment, because he knew that the Emancipation Proclamation would have been declared unconstitutional once the war was over. But yeah, John Quincy Adams, also the lawyer in the Amistad trial. If you've ever seen the movie Amistad, you see that Anthony Hopkins plays John Quincy Adams. A really good story and really good movie. I highly recommend you check it out. So yeah, I'm a big fan of John Quincy Adams. I just don't know that I'd go so far as to say he was one of our greatest presidents of all time.
That just might be where Lincoln got the idea for the Emancipation Proclamation. Andrew Jackson was perhaps the only president in history brave enough to take on the banks. His enemies accused him of class warfare, which basically means fighting for the poor and weak against the rich and powerful.
Unless you were poor and weak and Native American. Different story then. And Andrew Jackson, I believe it was during his presidency, was the last time the United States was out of debt. So I give him credit for that. Very forceful guy. Probably next to Theodore Roosevelt, probably the kind of the most manly, kind of toughest SOB to ever be president, I guess you could say. But I'm just not a fan. There's just too many things about the guy's character I don't like a lot. That's all I'll say.
Believe it or not, Martin Van Buren's presidency marked real victory for diversity. He was the first president whose ancestry was not English. In fact, he remains to this day the only president in history who spoke English as a second language, and his supporters were quite diverse for the time.
Dutch, I believe, was his first language, and he also was the first president born in the United States. And what I mean by that is he was the first person born after the United States actually became a country and wasn't born in British America. All the previous presidents were born before independence.
Van Buren rejected the admission of Texas into the Union on the grounds that it would cause war with Mexico. He turned out to be right. Prior to being elected president and promptly dying, William Henry Harrison found a way of spreading American values through Latin America that didn't involve the overthrow of democratically elected leaders. He urged the legendary Latin American revolutionary Simón Bolívar to adopt democratic policies. It didn't exactly take, but it was worth a shot. Gotta be honest.
And William Henry Harrison, his father signed the Declaration of Independence. His son was a congressman, John Scott Harrison. Fascinating story there about how his body was stolen by body snatchers, John Scott Harrison, and found by his son, Benjamin Harrison, who became president. So only grandfather-grandson combination to ever be presidents.
John Tyler's a tough one, but when he retired from the House of Representatives, he endorsed his former opponent for the seat. That's a pretty classy move.
And to this day, John Tyler, born in the 1700s, has a living grandson. He had two, but I think one of them has since passed away. But yeah, John Tyler had just a bazillion children. He was married twice. His second wife was Julia Gardner Tyler, who's a distant cousin of my wife through the Gardner family. And she was much younger than him, and so he had basically a whole second generation of children. And one of those children he had when he was in his 60s, then turned around and had children in his 60s. And it's one of those grandsons who is now still alive, or at least was last I heard. He's buried in Richmond, real close to James Monroe. They're buried right in the same section of Hollywood Cemetery.
It's generally agreed that Polk came through on his campaign promises. One of them was that he would not seek re-election after one successful term. Sure enough, that's exactly what he did.
And that's commendable. It's difficult to get into power, to know you could hang on to power, and to willingly let it go. George Washington did that and set a great standard that held until Franklin Roosevelt. And I give Polk a lot of credit. And I think generally Polk is rated very highly by historians as president. I think he's usually around the top 10, if not just outside of it.
Despite being a slave owner himself, Zachary Taylor did not push for the expansion of slavery. Millard Fillmore...
Sorry, that's the best I've got. Zachary Taylor's son, Richard Taylor, was a 3-star general in the Confederate Army. His daughter was Jefferson Davis's first wife. He was a Kentuckian himself. Listen, Zachary Taylor, obviously this guy's not going to go there because that would mean to speak favorably in the war of against Mexico, and he's not going to do that. But Zachary Taylor was a great military leader, won some incredible victories in the war with Mexico. You don't have to like it. Ulysses S. Grant was strongly opposed to the war in Mexico, but still fought in the war in Mexico and still spoke very highly of Zachary Taylor as a general.
Zachary Taylor did not push for the expansion of slavery. Millard Fillmore more or less lived the American dream.
And looked like Alec Baldwin, didn't he? I mean, if you dyed Alec Baldwin's hair white, he could totally pull off Millard Fillmore.
No formal schooling as a child and was born in a log cabin. Despite this, he rose to become president of the United States, and that's worth some admiration. Franklin Pierce, like most of the pre-Civil War presidents, is largely remembered as a total failure. But in that incredibly polarizing climate, few, if any, could really have gotten much of anything good done. Pierce was known to be a warm person and a skilled politician. He tried to be a unifier. His failures were quite likely unavoidable consequences of his time.
Unavoidable consequences of his time, and horrible tragedy in his life. I talk about this all the time, but his only son was killed in a train accident where his parents were present. The son was he was a child, and he was basically decapitated right in front of his parents. It was pretty horrifying, and Franklin Pierce never recovered, and I can't imagine any of us would have from something like that.
Buchanan is rightly remembered for his great devotion to the law. Lincoln is...
That's all we get for Buchanan. I don't know what else you could really say positively about him.
Is quite often...
Does it say overcame crippling ugliness? I don't know. I'm not attracted to men, so I can't speak to it. And I know a lot of people say that, but gosh, I mean, we're going to be that superficial.
Ranked as the greatest president in American history, and for good reason. He saw the country through its most turbulent time, winning the Civil War. Although he did not do it alone, he oversaw the end of slavery. He cleverly pitted his enemies against each other, and his Gettysburg Address is one of the most beautiful political speeches in history.
First of all, I don't know if I know what he's saying by political speech because it was made by a politician, but it wasn't a political speech. But and his second inaugural is phenomenal too. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial, the Gettysburg Address is on one side, his second inaugural is on the other. That's the one he gave about a month before he died. It was when everybody knew the Civil War was about to be over. He's trying to think ahead to reuniting the country. And so he starts, he talks about things like, he says, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. He starts talking about striving forward to finish the work that they're in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who has borne the battle, for his widow and for his orphan, and to achieve for ourselves and our future generations a lasting peace with ourselves and all generations and other nations. And, it's just really just this sweeping kind of speech about coming back together, about reconciling with the South, about taking care of the families of the soldiers who fought the war, about stepping out on the world stage and achieving peace with other nations. It's phenomenal stuff. And I mourn for our country that we didn't get to see what a post-war Lincoln could have done to help with the healing process. And certainly in light of what Johnson did afterwards.
Andrew Johnson was a strict
Not Jackson, because as many of you pointed out in yesterday's video, he put Andrew Jackson under the picture of Andrew Johnson.
Constitutionalist.
I didn't even catch what he said about him.
Speeches in history. Andrew Johnson was a strict constitutionalist.
Which I know is something that this guy seems to like, but it's interesting. Well, I don't know if he does like it, because the guy doing this video seems to be pretty much in favor of very progressive presidents, which don't typically go hand in hand with a strict constructionist view of the Constitution. That's typically a conservative point of view.
Ulysses S. Grant did much to stop the KKK's reign of terror, promote the 15th Amendment, seat black state legislators in southern states, and make peace with Native American tribes.
One of the most undervalued presidents when it comes to civil rights, probably about the greatest champion of freed slaves that there was in the aftermath of the war. And while he mentions, Grant, if there's to be a criticism of Grant, it's that he permitted the Native American policy to go in the direction it did toward the end of his second term with the Sioux War, where they find gold in the Black Hills right after we signed a treaty with the Sioux over the Black Hills, and then turned right around and took it from them. And while I don't think he was necessarily in favor of the policy, he did kind of permit it in the end, and I think he rightfully should be criticized for not standing up for that situation.
Hayes contributed greatly to the modernization of the American bureaucracy, installing a merit-based appointment process, weeding out corruption in the postal service, and issuing an executive order that made it illegal for federal office holders to be forced to participate in party politics.
And that's really underrated stuff right there. They had this thing called the spoils system, which is, the spoils of war. We win, we get to take. And the idea was all your political cronies got appointments. And that's still true to a point. It still happens, but not nearly the way that it did then. A lot of very unqualified people got jobs just because of who they knew and because of who they supported. And it's under Hayes, Garfield, and Arthur that really starts to change.
If he was never assassinated, Garfield likely would have continued the civil service reforms initiated by Hayes. He recognized that blacks were being denied their civil rights, wanted to extend public education to blacks, and appointed several black leaders like Frederick Douglass to powerful positions in government.
Love for minorities and lasagna, the play on the Garfield thing. I think the one yesterday said hates Mondays. Same thing. Garfield the cat. Also, I believe our only ordained minister who was ever president.
Like few politicians of his time, Chester A. Arthur avoided scandal and corruption and was known to be true to his word. Grover Cleveland also opposed political corruption as well as imperialism. Benjamin Harrison...
Wait, let's go back. Friend of honesty, sovereignty, and Elmo, because Grover, Grover, that kind of thing.
Opposed political corruption as well as imperialism. Benjamin Harrison attempted to secure federal education funding and voting rights enforcement for black Americans. McKinley's presidency marked rapid economic growth and a decisive victory in the Spanish-American War.
Which is interesting because yesterday his criticism had to do with the Spanish-American War, and then he turns around and says that a great thing about him is that he won the Spanish-American War. I don't get how both can be true at the same time. He did the same thing with Washington. He kind of chose both sides of the same coin for bad and good. That's weird.
Teddy Roosevelt was a great defender of conservationism, establishing numerous national parks.
And almost always regarded as a top 5 president by people of both political parties.
He broke up corporate monopolies, supported labor unions, and pressed Congress to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act, which banned impure or falsely labeled consumables.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that happened during Roosevelt's administration that we still reap the benefits for today. The what became the FDA, certainly one of them, the national parks, conservation, things like that. Also, just an all-around, just hardcore dude. I've shared stories about him in other videos, and I won't get into too many of them. My favorite is probably when he had somebody steal his boat and go down river with it, so he built another boat for himself, got in it, tracked the guys down, stayed up for like 2 days to bring them to justice. Set up a boxing ring in the East Room of the White House where he was punched in the wrong place at one point and blinded in one eye because of it. But also probably responsible for giving the world Woodrow Wilson, which I will never forgive him for.
Taft actually broke up more monopolies than Roosevelt, and the widely believed story that he was so fat he got stuck in a White House bathtub, well, unfortunately,
Nope.
That's not true.
Didn't happen.
Woodrow Wilson is best known for promoting global democracy and establishing the League of Nations, the predecessor of the UN. He innovated a regulatory approach to breaking up monopolies. He avoided fighting in World War I until Germans sunk American ships. Although the US had played a relatively small role in the war, Wilson played a pivotal role in the Paris Peace Conference.
Yeah. Okay.
Harding supported equal political rights for blacks, spoke
Not
out
nearly as racist as he looks. How does a person look racist? I don't know.
against lynching, and released political prisoners, like socialist leader Eugene Debs, who was imprisoned by Wilson for speaking out against the war. Coolidge called for the federal criminalization of lynching and granted U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans living on reservations. Herbert Hoover wanted to focus on eliminating waste in government institutions, but was instead forced to spend his presidency dealing with the Great Depression.
Which is interesting, too, because if you were to go back 10 years and handpick somebody who would probably be perfect to deal with the Depression, it would be a guy like Herbert Hoover. Brilliant guy, really smart, Midwesterner, came from the place that was one of the places that was hit hardest by the Depression, was Secretary of Commerce before the war, or before the Depression. You would think set up perfectly to deal with it, but really didn't help.
He attempted to combat it with large-scale public works projects like the Hoover Dam. FDR actually used similar tactics quite successfully. FDR saw the United States through a period of economic disaster and global war. But the most crucial aspect of his legacy was the New Deal. He created Social Security and reformed the financial system to prevent future collapse. Indeed, the U.S. did not experience another serious financial crisis until the critical aspects of his financial reforms, like the Glass-Steagall Act, were dismantled. Truman prioritized civil rights. He integrated the military and federal agencies.
Yeah, he integrated the military, I think, in 1948. First time going all the way back to, I guess, the Revolutionary War, where white and black enlisted men would serve in the same unit. So that was a big, big deal. And probably an underrated thing that Truman did.
And he proposed the creation of federal offices to protect voting rights and fair employment practices. Eisenhower created NASA and warned the country of the dangers of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, that was his farewell address before he left after his 2 terms in office. Again, a pretty highly rated president, usually in the top 10 in most lists that I've seen. He was really, I mean, of all the people who have been elected president who were generals, people like Zachary Taylor, Ulysses S. Grant, Eisenhower, he's probably the one that was best equipped to be president because his role in the military was never really about his military leadership. It was his leadership ability in terms of being a good politician. That was why he made such a good supreme commander in Europe. He knew how to pull people together and get everybody behind a common goal when you have people from different countries. And he knew how to deal with de Gaulle and how to deal with Churchill and how to say what needed to be said for the Americans and how to lead the people under him and bring all these different folks from different militaries together.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Kennedy
Not bad for a guy who comes from a military background to be willing to say that.
took responsibility for the Bay of Pigs, even though it was actually the previous administration that planned it. He negotiated a test ban treaty, championed Medicare, and inspired America to go to the moon.
So the thing there at the bottom, did things not because they are easy, but because they are he was hard. Okay. So that's kind of a play on a couple of things. One, a speech. The speech that he gave, I think, at Rice University, which I think was phenomenal. I think we missed that as a country, people setting out bold goals like that and getting the country to rally behind it. That was where he laid out the vision of we set a goal to go to the moon, to put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth by the end of this decade. We do this and the other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And then we went out and did it a couple months before the end of the decade. I love that optimism. I love that setting of a goal like that. But it's also a play on his philandering.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
LBJ worked against great opposition to get the Civil Rights Bill passed into law. He had to convince Republicans to vote for the bill, and successfully convinced their leader, Everett Dirksen, to make it happen.
This is probably a little bit of my conservative bias showing here, so challenge me on it if you disagree. More Republicans voted for that bill than Democrats, percentage-wise. It was actually Southern Democrats who were the hardest to convince to support that bill, and I don't think Johnson initially supported it himself as a Southern Democrat. I think he had to be convinced. I'm not going to take the time to look up the stats on that because that's not really what this video is about, but not entirely sure I'm convinced of that argument that Johnson brought the Republicans around. I don't know.
Nixon enforced the integration of Southern schools, ended the war in Vietnam, and created the EPA. Ford didn't get much done in his short time in office.
You're welcome, Chevy. All right, so Ford, Chevy, but also Chevy Chase played him on Saturday Night Live. We're going to stop right there. That's where I like to stop just because we're starting to get dangerously close into stuff people will argue a lot about. So let me know your thoughts about all of that. Use the comment section below. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. I did a post asking for your input about your favorite reaction videos that I've done. This Wednesday will be 1 year since my very first reaction video, so I want to do a top 10 list of my 10 favorite ones that I've done. So if you have any input into that, see that post and respond to it. Thanks a lot. We'll see you again soon.